In the house, and great to have him back. Just recently returned from Zimbabwe as the doctor of the Springbok under-21, under-20 squad. Under-20 squad, so doing national duty.
Yes, for our country. Our ladies did us very proud there.
Absolutely.
The under-20 ladies.
Great to have you back in the studio,
sir.
man. Great to have a Medical Tuesday chat with you. Of course, the month of July focuses on mental health awareness. Of course, mental health is important all year round, but putting emphasis on these issues this month gives us the opportunity to come together to show our support and efforts for those who suffer from mental disorders. And here to help us unpack them, of course, the topic of the day, focusing on eating disorders more specifically, our trusted medical advisor, Dr. Darrren Green. I hope the trip was good.
It was. It was an absolute eye-opener to appreciate what we have back home. But the people of Zimbabwe are extremely warm and hospitable, and absolutely, what a pleasure to meet them.
And I'm sure at some point as well, it could be argued that the mentality of the country of Zimbabwe was took a massive knock due to what happened, and that's why we're focusing on mental health issues all around. But like, as we said today, specifically eating disorders.
Absolutely.
So, how do people with eating disorders see themselves? And then let's also start by defining exactly what is an eating disorder.
100%. So I think the relationship with food and then the psychological distress because of that relationship are the two main components associated with eating disorders. What defines it obviously is when it has an effect, a knock-on effect on your health, specifically your mental health, your physical health, and then with that all the associated medical problems that arise because of the eating disorder. So in terms of the relationship with food, we use food for different things. Sometimes we use it to comfort us, comfort eating. Sometimes we use it when we're anxious to try and soothe the anxiety. So the triggers can be quite numerous, but also how you are brought up by your parents and their view of how they teach you how to see food. Is food fuel? Is food a form of reward when you do something like, something? So all that plays a massive role in the behaviors associated and your perception of food going down the line, obviously. And with that comes, obviously, the self-loathing, the low esteem. Because if you eat too much, you feel guilty. If you eat too little, you start seeing the effect on the body. If you starve yourself, you see an effect. So it all starts off like that, but it then goes down a path.
And the eating disorder thing, it goes both ways. It's not just for people who eat for comfort or anxiety, but people who starve themselves or deprive themselves of food for any particular given reason.
Correct. And often the triggers are a perception of what the role of food does to them. They actually then start intensely disliking food itself, no matter what the food, where they then stay away from all food. Food actually it repulses them. Where, compared to the association, obviously, of a physical symptom of feeling unhappy with your body, which is more body dysmorphia and that kind of thing. But self-esteem and the link between psychology and how you view yourself is massive in this process.
How common is it to have to see patients that suffer from eating disorders?
Yeah, I'd say between 2 and 4% of people have eating disorders. In certain areas and populations and socioeconomic groups, it's even higher. Where you can imagine in the era of Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, the perceptions around what's acceptable in terms of a body image all plays a role as well. So it all plays a massive role in where we have increased incidence of the
we're not doing ourselves exactly any favors in the way that these algorithms are designed to show off this kind of body or that kind of body that people are envious of. If we were to look at two different forms of eating disorders, in anorexia nervosa?
Yes, anorexia is a well-known one.
Yes, and bulimia.
Bulimia, yes.
What are the differences there?
Yes, so anorexia is basically where your relationship with food is such that you try and stay away from food. You actually eat very, very little or close to starvation, where you lose 15% of your body weight in quite a rapid period of time, and you often then present with the medical complications of that, with a suppressed immune system, malnutrition, GIT, gastrointestinal tract disorders, and then obviously with that then the psychological distress of not eating. Because not eating affects your concentration, it affects your ability to learn, to perform, to do exercise and so forth. So they often associated learned behaviors then that would come on board with anorexia in keeping you really, really skinny and thin on the outside, and because you want to stay away from food, you then obsess with your personality type on something else, like exercise. So not only do you weigh and count every single the size of the bite you're taking even becomes important. You'll find obviously cutting up the food into small, tiny pieces. But then you'll also see with that then the associated behaviors of suddenly having a drastic change in focusing on exercising, for example, from half an hour a day to almost 4 hours a day.
Yeah.
So that's where it all plays a massive role.
Yeah. And bulimia specifically?
So bulimia is more type of a binge eating where you consume food and then induce purging. Simply put, vomiting.
Yeah.
Where you then you're so disgusted with yourself, you initially satisfy the void that you're trying to fill by eating a lot, and then you try to rid that because of the guilt and because of the process. Yeah. So there are different kinds of clinical signs and symptoms that we see when we see the warning signs of bulimia as well.
All right. Well, we're going to continue this conversation as we open up this conversation during the month of July, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. And today we're focusing on the mental health issues associated with eating disorders more specifically. Do engage with us on social media and let us know your thoughts.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back. You're live with Expresso as we hone in on a vitally important conversation. All this month we are dealing with mental issues as this is Mental Health Awareness Month. And of course we've got an incredible brain to lean on, but a guy who I think certainly feels the emotion behind something like this. It's always
Absolutely.
a very difficult space when the mind and emotion, where body and heart kind of meet. And of course the repercussions of some of the disorders that we've already broached on anorexia, bulimia, really, really intense. So it's so important that all of us educate ourselves.
No, absolutely.
I want to talk about anorexia
Yes.
and bulimia. Of course, those are, I always call food the acceptable addiction and staying away from food as well. It's an addiction as well. Let's talk about the psychological basis for these kind of eating disorders.
Yeah, so often there's an accompanying trigger that's led people to the relationship or how they define their relationship with food. There could be trauma in their past, there could be anxiety, and then obviously soothing by eating, and then there could be depression as well, where you're trying to fill a void in that state. So understanding that combined with certain personality types that are more prone to developing eating disorders, things like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, where you start obsessing on a specific part of your body that you don't like, your body image, body dysmorphia, all those things, then lead to you becoming psychologically distressed because you're unhappy with something in your physical self. And then that then spills over into the behaviors that affect then your attempt to change what you dislike and what's causing that psychological.
What are the first signs from a carer, from a parent, from someone, a partner? What should be that? Because we're all conscious. This is a fashion disease.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, it's something that's almost promoted in mass media. I would imagine social media doesn't help.
100%.
When should we become nervous when when watching your weight becomes a disorder?
So I think when someone's conversation is dominated by conversations around food, their relationship with food, the role of food, the perception of food, if someone could have a normal conversation with you and now suddenly there's such a dramatic shift and change
and
in
all
that
the time,
focus,
they're not just on diet, but it's like that all the time.
It's absolutely obsessed, and literature and learning, etc. about it. That is the first thing. So look at the conversation topics that have now occurred and what the frequency and intensity of those conversations. Then look at the behavior around food. Look at the communication that comes back I ate at my friend's place. I've eaten enough at school. Or I ate something on the way home and so forth. How you start then distancing yourself from group eating or family gatherings in terms of food. And then even within those, if you have really vigilant parents within that system, you start then learning compensatory behaviors even while you're in the group of cutting up your food. Delaying, talking a lot so that everyone's focused on what you're saying, you're flamboyant, you're leading the conversation. So it's often very much brought about by a control issue. So we starve our bodies, for example, for control. We then either eat too much and then feel guilty about it and then have to do something about it, once again, showing control. So there's a lot of control in the psychodynamics, control issues around it as well.
I think we know the health complications with anorexia.
Yes.
But what are the health complications with bulimia?
Yeah, so the difference here is anorexia, you lose more than 15% of your body weight. Your BMI is so dramatically low, obviously, that you have almost 0% body fat left, with obviously skin and bone. So with bulimia, what happens is you are eating, you actually do a lot of binge eating in
Yes.
bulimia. But then the guilt comes in, and you can purge from 1 to 46 times a week. Purging implicates vomiting, obviously,
up,
as well. Also, to get rid of those perceived calorie intakes, people then take laxatives. They take diuretics, which cause you to urinate, obviously, as well, to
Yeah.
lose water mass.
Yeah.
And all those carry with it, obviously, massive health implications for hydration, electrolyte imbalance, kidney issues, etc. And then your immunity, malnourishment, obviously affects
Yeah.
all the systems in the body. And from consistently vomiting and bulimia, you can imagine with the acid
damage
reflux,
that you're doing, yeah.
gum disease, teeth, the enamel gets destroyed.
Yes.
Often there's a telltale sign on the finger from inducing
Of
vomiting with
course,
your
of
finger.
course, yeah.
So you'll see skin that's flaked and obviously red, inflamed on the
Okay.
index finger or any other
So
finger.
it's acid. It's acids that come
Yeah,
out. Is
correct.
there, so much of this is understandable just purely from a situational kind of space and knowing the pressures that are on, especially, I think, young girls would see, but it's not necessarily just something that's experienced by young women. But is there a biological basis? Are some people more predisposed to eating disorders than others?
So the whole chicken egg theory. So you have, for example, the eating disorder that can cause changes in the nerve transmitter levels in the brain and the different relationship between serotonin, dopamine, etc., glutamine, and that then can affect the mood disorders that are associated and follow up. On the other side, you have people that have an underlying obsessive compulsive disorder or anxiety, which leads them to seek a crutch in something
Some
like
kind of-
a controlled environment of controlling your food.
kind of channel for
so
that,
there's almost this two-way seesaw ride that could happen from
Yeah.
both sides. So yes, certainly there are associated neuropsychological and psychiatric complications involved from both of these conditions.
Sure. I want to jump into the treatments for both anorexia and bulimia. So we're going to catch up with you again
Fantastic.
after this. Thank you so much, Dr. Darrren Green. We are talking about food, our relationship with food. We are talking about mental health awareness. It's something we should be talking about throughout the year, but it is something that is dedicated to the month of July. And of course, when it comes to eating as well.
It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back. You're live with Expresso, sitting with Dr. Darrren Green, talking about, in particular, eating disorders and Mental Illness Awareness Month. July is a big month for awareness. We love these platforms. It's one thing to raise awareness, to educate people. It's another thing to be able to speak directly to the person that is going through this. How do you get a person out of that bubble? We've been dealing primarily with anorexia and bulimia, very different, but kind of stemming from the same maybe obsession, maybe the same root essentially. But for me, the most important thing is to be able to speak to that person who's in that space, and we know families are affected by it. How do we start to treat an eating disorder in that mental space?
Yeah, I think once you know that someone has an eating disorder and you've spotted the signs, the symptoms that we've discussed already, I think the first thing is understanding that that person needs to come to terms with they have a problem. So the triggers that I mentioned earlier on could have been a traumatic event. It could be anxiety or depression. So part of the treatment of the root cause of this would be to treat the underlying
Like
mood
you would
issue.
any other mental
Correct.
disorder.
Get to that started the process in the first place. And that involves obviously medical treatment where you're looking at better energy levels, mood control issues and so forth. It also involves, very importantly, psychotherapy. So psychotherapy has different components to it, and one of the big ones in terms of looking at your relationship with food and understanding your thought processes around the role of food in your life, the control issues, the psychological distress associated with the entire thing, is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
It's rewiring the brain.
Rewiring the brain and looking at specifically your perceptions, what caused them, understanding whether they are rational, good perceptions or not, how to change those perceptions, how to then modify your behavior according to adjusting those cognitions and thought processes going forward. That, obviously, combined with medication, obviously, and food counseling, is massive, massive.
Inpatient, like any other addiction, we know that the food addiction is probably one of the most pervasive and one of the most difficult to deal with. Inpatient treatment, at what point do you get to that? Is that an option available? Because I know a lot of
so
people
when
are
do you
sitting there.
send
Yeah,
someone
when
in?
do
Yeah.
you take that step? Because it's quite a scary thing, but it's a desperate situation.
It's something that I often speak about to my wife, who helps a lot with that kind of thing, in terms of inpatient treatment. But, you know, we look at things like, for example, the family just see someone becoming really, really tired, wasting away. Immunologically, they're more prone to opportunistic infections, frequent disease, etc., etc. And you often find that the concentration and mental sharpness also then starts going down. So when would someone go in? Well, you would measure, obviously, their body weight. Their BMIs are a good indication. The body fat percentages are a good indication. But even more so when they do blood tests with a diagnosis, the signs of malnutrition involving the liver, the protein content in the body, the fat content in the body, all that kind of thing, all plays a role. But I would say if it affects your daily living to a degree where you can't sustain a job, where it's affecting your performance at work, your performance as a member of the family in terms of being a parent, for example, as well, or even a sibling where you can't concentrate in the classroom because adolescents are the highest risk group, then that's when you need help, and that's when you need to go for help urgently.
Just very quickly, in about 20 seconds, how long does it take to recover, and what can they expect in that recovery process?
So when we look at remodeling the brain and your cognitions and perceptions around food, you're looking at a period of weeks to months. Often it takes 10 years for a bulimic to work through the process and get over it. So often you'd find the story typically of someone having it in their 13 to 18 year age group, and then 10 years later only really with intensive therapy really get through it.
But it is an opportunity to redefine yourself. You are not alone, and I think families, don't judge, don't make it about yourself. Become practical and look at ways that you can help a person, and that I think speaks to all mental disorders. All of us live on the spectrum in one way or another. To be completely honest, we all need to be able to help each other, but just take the self-judgment out of it. Do something about it. Now is the time to do it, and there are professionals out there to help you.
Thank
love
you,
you,
sir.
Absolutely
Thank you.
love you.